When the eviction notice was clipped to the cabin door and the sheriff's cruiser idled at the end of the gravel lane, he laughed. Short, sharp, like a match struck and dropped. Because the notice said in tiny bureaucratic font that he had 30 days to leave despite owning the lake and, more importantly, the only access road the HOA liked to call common property. He laughed, then watched the HOA president in a pressed navy suit, Martin Ellsworth, go pale in the cool lake light, like someone who'd been banking on thunder and suddenly seen a bullet. Wait, what just happened? The paper trembled in his hand. The officer's hand hovered over his radio. The meeting room upstairs still hummed with gossip and the faint smell of spilled coffee. A clock somewhere ticked an accusation. The cold open lasts 3 heartbeats and then snaps the world back. Because he remembers the first letter, folded like a stone, delivered with the kind of righteous flourish only a small-town committee can manufacture. The scene rewinds. Back when the dispute was nothing more than a whisper and a sticky note on the bulletin board, the cabin sat like a stubborn punctuation mark at the end of a sentence. Weathered cedar, a crooked porch, blue-gray shutters that the wind had kissed into flaking. People called it an eyesore only after they learned it belonged to him. He had lived there 17 summers, measured in fish hooks and burn marks on the countertop, in hurricanes and harvest moons. The lake answered to his name on the deed the same way the moon answered to tides. The HOA, on the other hand, answered to its minutes, its bylaws, and most importantly, a president who liked to think of himself as everybody's steward and nobody's friend. He was Jonah Mercer, late 30s, quietly strong, a grin that only surfaced when he wanted to disarm trouble. Once a volunteer firefighter, once an investigator for a city paper, Jonah kept the lake clean because he knew where the line between preservation and possession blurred. He could read a map the way some people read faces. He could see a line item and trace back to the paragraph that made it illegal. He kept a toolbox, a law clerk's patience, and a deep quiet that made other people uncomfortable. Unknown to Martin, Jonah had a ledger in the cabin drawer that read like a map. Deeds, tax receipts, fading letters from an aunt who'd taught him how to fight without getting his knuckles dirty. When push came to shove, Jonah could be methodical in a way that looked like mercy, until the mercy ran thin. Martin Ellsworth was 60, trim, and immaculate as a church usher on Sunday morning. He wore a watch that was too new for the town and shoes that never touched mud. He had a voice that could smile while cutting you in half and a habit of marking people's mail as a hobby. He preferred signatures that agreed with his opinion. He prided himself on rules. He prided himself most on power. He had an uncanny ability to show up at the precise moment conflict needed a face. He loved delivering a gavel slam of a sentence, in a meeting that smelled of disinfectant and old donuts. He collected complaints like others collected stamps. The hypocrisy was not subtle. He had built a 3-car garage on the covenanted frontage he once forbade someone else to expand, and when the town's mayor drove past Martin's white columns, Martin waved like a man who'd been knighted. In the beginning, the HOA's complaints were petty. Trim your hedges, repaint the fence, stop leaving kayaks on the shoreline. Small, repetitive annoyances that tasted like salt and shame when you read them under a lamp at midnight. Jonah fixed things. He trimmed hedges to the exact height the bylaw required. He painted the shutters a shade of blue that made the water look like an old coin. He made peace offerings in the form of pies. The HOA sent more notices. The notices multiplied like mold. At the 76th word of the first complaint, Jonah filed a counter. He had a feeling. A legal itch. He took his deed to the town archive, felt the paper as if he'd been handed a pulse. There it was. A clause, buried in 1932, ignored by the HOA minutes and fought by 100 sleepy lawyers. He photocopied the clause until the machine complained. In his mouth, the metal taste of justice arrived, cold, inevitable. Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far HOA power reaches. He put the question into the silence like a pebble into still water. The words felt silly and true all at once. He'd already decided he was not going to walk. The first knowledge bomb arrives like a pebble, a sentence that lands inside a tense meeting, casual and lethal. An HOA cannot forcibly evict a property owner without a judicial writ. Covenants don't override state eviction laws. Jonah read it aloud, calm as a man reciting the weather, and Martin's smile hardened. The room smelled of old coffee and dust. The hum of an aquarium motor somewhere swallowed the last of Martin's bluster. The fact was small, technical, and brutal. The kind that removes a foundation brick from a boastful building. People in the meeting blinked. Microphones caught the rustle of paper. Knowledge, like a key, turning. Sensory details. The click of a pen that sounded like a metronome. The taste of black coffee that Jonah hadn't finished. The cold bite in his palms when he touched the original deed. He could smell diesel from the road, cedar from his porch, and the faint antiseptic polish that Martin used like armor. Those smells layered the scene like a score. Jonah's tactic was slow, like a river carving stone. He started with paperwork, photocopies, and certified mail, filings that smelled of toner and worry. He began a file called Lake Rights that sat on his kitchen table like a sleeping animal. He spent nights reading municipal codes by flashlight while a storm batted at the roof. He made friends with the town clerk, whose name was Rosa, and who kept the records like she kept secrets. Carefully, and only for people who could make it through her door without smelling of entitlement. Jonah learned that the HOA had skipped one minor but vital procedural step in a 1998 special assessment vote: notice requirements. Small things like notice could topple empires. The HOA's petty vendetta escalated when someone, Jonah never found out who at first, let a rumor creep out like mist. Jonah's dock was unsafe, his septic non-compliant, his cabin a blight. Suddenly neighbors who had once waved at him over the mailboxes began to stare as if he had some contagion. A woman with a poodle clutched her purse a little tighter when Jonah walked past. The poodle yapped like a metronome counting. Down. Jonah felt the town's cold curiosity more than he felt any threat. The first major escalation was a sign, literally. On a Monday, a bright plywood placard appeared at the intersection. Beautification Task Force, meeting tonight. Its paint smelled sharp, like enamel and anger. The sign's presence changed the lane's math. People who had been neutral drifted towards the meeting with the nervous energy of moths to a porch light. Jonah could taste copper in his mouth. Fear, adrenaline. The two were siblings at times, like this. A knock at his door came the night before the meeting. It rattled the thin panes like an accusation. Jonah opened and found an envelope slipped through the crack. No return address. Inside, a photo of his property, taken at sunset, with a red circle around the dock and a line of handwriting: comply or fine. The photograph left a greasy thumbprint on his conscience. He turned the paper over and saw a notation. Filed, 6/12. Someone was readying a dossier. He decided to attend the meeting not as a defendant, but as an observer, a man cataloging ammunition without firing. The room smelled of lemon cleaner and the kind of cheap wood that peels at the edges. Martin presided at the head of the long table, a model of composure. He wore a pin with the HOA logo like a medal. His voice, when he spoke, was syrupy and precise. Jonah watched Martin deliver the proclamation about community standards with an easy cruelty, the kind that learned the art of smiling while circling the throat. Jonah asked one question, simple, pointed. What specific ordinance permits this sign-off without a certified structural report? It sounded like a pebble landing in a pond. Heads turned. Martin's jaw did the small, involuntary twitch of a cornered animal. The room went warm with the smell of bodies breathing together. Fear and anticipation braided. Jonah's question was a sieve that would let the truth through. At 50% through this first act, around the midpoint knowledge bomb, another legal fact slides into dialogue like a blade. HOAs are bound by their own bylaws. If enforcement is selective, it can constitute an illegal selective enforcement, or even harassment under state statutes. Jonah said it to a woman who had been paid to take minutes and whose fingers trembled when she wrote. The word harassment tasted heavy. It shifted the moral axis. The room felt colder, as if someone had turned down the thermostat. Martin's eyes flicked to a legal pad. He exhaled the scent of cheap aftershave. Sensory cluster. Rain started. The first hard drops on the roof like timpani. The roughness of the wooden chair under Jonah's thighs. The dull hum of the overhead fluorescent lights that buzzed like a distant argument. Smells. Lemon oil on the table. the faint reek of old paper records. He could feel the sticky warmth of the meeting rooms, air against his neck. Jonah's allies were an odd, beautiful assortment. Rosa, the clerk, brought him old minutes that smelled of mold and possibility. A retired surveyor with a rusty knee, Tom, handed him a tattered map with property lines drawn in ink and a margin note. Lake deed shows riparian rights. Young attorney named Leah, who had moved back to town for reasons Jonah would later learn were both financial and familial, offered free counsel after seeing the passion in his file. They became an unplanned crew, a ragtag band that found cohesion in outrage. Martin's leverage was the HOA's camera, literal surveillance cameras he had recently installed ostensibly for community safety. The cameras were black, like beetles, mounted where they could watch the dock. They had a voyeur's gaze, and Martin liked watching. He would print frames from nights when Jonah sat by the water and hand them out at meetings like evidence of nocturnal nuisance. He called them concerns. He used them to stoke fear. There was something animal about how he reveled in being the town's eye. Jonah's counterattack was not Hollywood blockbuster theater. It was hours at the county courthouse, fingers numb from the copier paper's edges, breath fogging in the car on early mornings. He subpoenaed meeting minutes. He watched the surveillance footage with a cold eye and realized a detail. One camera's angle had been cropped in the file, a neat rectangle missing where the dock's ledger should have been. Someone had edited the footage. Someone had the technical means to clean the narrative and make it lie. The more Jonah peeled back the layers, the more rot he found in the HOA's process. Fines had been levied inconsistently, payments rerouted, minutes amended after the fact. There were signatures too neat, dates that bumped against each other like teeth. Jonah's stomach turned when he found a vendor invoice for landscaping and notice services, with an address that matched Martin's niece's landscaping company. Conflict of interest smelled like cheap perfume and sweaty palms. A second micro cliffhanger. At the end of a long day, Jonah opened a box marked HOA Legal, and inside, beneath a mountain of stamped envelopes, lay a single file. A claimed transfer of right, dated 5 years earlier, witnessed by 2 neighbors who'd since moved away. The signatures were crisp, practiced, suspiciously similar. He traced the strokes with a thumb and realized they were not just forged, they were practiced to be forgery-proof. He had been punched in the gut by the casualness of it. The community began to fracture. Some people saw Jonah as a fight they did not want, others a rallying point. Conversations at the hardware store shifted from paint colors to ethics. The handyman who fixed porches started to offer discounts for anyone fighting the HOA. The scent of sawdust and motor oil in the shop took on a metallic edge. Hope, maybe, or fear. Jonah felt both. He felt thirst at odd hours and slept badly. Then, the smear campaign went public. Someone had taken a minor septic infraction, talentless, quickly fixed, and amplified it with late-night posters that accused Jonah of polluting the lake. The posters were pasted to lamp posts, flickering in the streetlight. They smelled like wet glue and malice. The posters changed the game's tempo. Neighbors who once brought him fresh bread now crossed the street. Children pointed and asked their parents why someone would post lies. Jonah could feel his name in the air like fog, condensing on windows. Jonah's tactical past began to show, itself in small details. He set up watches, not because he expected violence, but because he knew where escalation lived, in silence and surprise. He learned to read the rhythm of the road, what hours people passed, when the mail came, the cadence of footsteps on his porch. He used to move through burning houses. Now he moved through paperwork with the same clinical focus. Where others saw a pile of minutes, he saw a plan. Where others heard gossip, he heard triggers. At 80% through the act, another knowledge bomb lands like a thrown key. Owning riparian rights to a private lake can grant you exclusive access and control over its use. An HOA cannot override recorded deed rights without an explicit legal conveyance or eminent domain proceeding. Jonah read the clause under the stooping lamp in his kitchen and felt the room tilt. If his deed stood, the lake belonged to him. If the lake belonged to him, the HOA's threats were theater. He smelled the paper. The ink tasted like the resolve in his bones. The sentence was technical, but in it lived the gist of a revolution. Sensory details. the metallic tang of late night coffee, the creak of the porch swing when he sat to think, the cool touch of the deed in his palm. The lake at night smelled like wet stone and cedar smoke, like a place that remembered everything. He went to bed with that smell in his nose and woke, with it in his throat. The cliffhanger that ends Act 1 must be a betrayed trust and a sudden escalation, a public, humiliating turn. Jonah had started to feel the ground shift beneath him. The town's ledger was flipping a page. He'd expected opposition. He had not expected a raid. On a Wednesday that began like any other, dawn low and pink over the water, men with masks and clipboards arrived at his property. They wore no sheriff's badge. They claimed to be marshal deputies, acting on an emergency HOA resolution. They had a paper that looked official because it was printed on heavy stock and cost deliberation. They started hauling his tools and locking his gate, citing imminent danger to property. Someone took photos. Someone filmed. The men moved like professionals. Jonah asked to see their authority. They smiled with the comfort of people who had practiced their lines. At first he thought it was harassment, the kind the law would chew and spit out. Then he saw the truck at the road, a municipal vehicle with county lettering he recognized. The blood left his face. They had a county inspector, or at least someone wearing that uniform, standing a step away while the men in masks loaded wood into a van. The uniform smelled of sunblock and diesel. He had not seen such coordinated action since bad fires in old factories. His throat tightened. A neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell from across the lane, hair like a cloud and hands that remembered, jam jars, approached with eyes wide. "They said the cabin was condemned," she whispered, as if whispering could keep the world from hearing. Her voice was sour with tea and something like fear. Jonah's mind cataloged everything in a dozen frames. The way the men moved, the numbers on the van, the way Martin stood at the edge of the lane with a phone pressed to his ear, and a smile that was both proud and predatory. He shoved past one of the men, demanded to see identification. Someone laughed, low and sharp. The laugh echoed and then vanished, like a bird that had been startled into flight. The masked man reached for a clipboard and pointed to a printed statement of emergency boarding. Jonah's hands felt like they belonged to someone else. His palms were cotton dry. He knew procedures. He had sat in courtrooms where things like this were performed by people who had finesse and a sense of the law's limits. He knew this was theater, but theater could have consequences. Then Martin stepped forward, all cologne and integrity, and announced in a tone he'd used 100 times at committee, "This is for the community's safety." His voice bounced off the lake and came back false. Jonah looked at the paper. The men in masks held. The signature at the bottom was faint, a looping scrawl he recognized. The HOA's chairman, backdated. The date on the form was yesterday. He felt his chest go very small. The air was sharp with the smell of cut hay and diesel. Jonah thought of the deed in his drawer and the clause he'd read by lamplight, and then he saw, tucked in the glove, compartment of the county truck, a copy of an order with the county seal. The order had been expedited, signed by an acting judge whose name Jonah had seen years ago on zoning appeals. He had never seen the judge in person. He felt a chill that was not entirely weather, a final micro cliffhanger. Jonah's phone buzzed. It was a text from Leah, the attorney, 3 words that cut through the racket. "Call me now." He had a dozen instincts. He also had a plan, but plans require time. The men were closing the gate. Where the first act ends, it must leave the reader with more questions than answers. Who signed the county order? Why did the inspector look like he had a dog in the fight? How did the HOA move so quickly and with so much officialdom? And, most corrosive of all, who in his town had decided that owning the lake did not matter anymore? Jonah's chest still trembled when he looked up at Martin. The HOA president's lips were a thin line. For the first time since Jonah had known the man, Martin looked genuinely afraid, not of Jonah but of something that had been set in motion that he had not expected to stop. Martin's phone screen glowed like a small, guilty fire. Jonah had a brief, involuntary thought. Everyone leaves a trail. The faint rustle of leaves sounded like the turning of pages. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love this ending. "Stick with me," Jonah would have said to an audience if this were a confession to the world. And he meant it. He shoved his hands into his pockets, feeling the coin of resolve there. He was not going anywhere. The last sensory slice, the taste of lake water in the air, brackish, alive, the smell of diesel, the sticky texture of fear on his palms. The gate clicked. The men in masks moved like a pack. Jonah watched, and the image of his deed in the drawer felt suddenly like a torch. And then the scene tightened to a single line. Jonah reached for his phone and hit dial. But before it could connect, a truck horn blared from the road and someone screamed his name. The phone in Jonah's hand vibrated like a heartbeat underwater. Leah's 3 words, "Call me now," glowed on the screen with a small, accusatory light. He could hear the men moving around the porch, the scrape of a boot against wood, the faint metallic clink of a clipboard hinge. The smell of diesel and cut grass sat heavy in the lane, and the lake rolled under a gray sky like a slow, patient breath. Jonah thumbed the call and held it to his ear while Martin Ellsworth stood at the road, the president's smile tightening. Into the thin line Jonah had learned to read as pretense worn thin. Leah's voice was low, urgent. "They've got an expedited order. County signed it. It looks authentic. But listen, something is off with the routing. Hold them. Don't sign anything." She said the words like a command. Jonah tasted copper on the roof of his mouth, adrenaline, and the salt of old coffee. He could hear Mrs. Caldwell whispering nearby, her knitted shawl rubbing like a soft wind against dry leaves. Her fingers tapped a nervous rhythm on a mason jar lid. The moment pressed in with the density of a storm cloud. Jonah moved like someone sketched in decades of emergency training. Every muscle remembered acts performed in different theaters, fires, deadlines, interviews. He spoke calmly, slow, deliberate, sentences that punctured panic. "We'll need to record every step. You get me anything that looks like a chain of custody. Ask that inspector for identification. Ask him to read his authority aloud." He could smell paper and ink from the clipboard held by a masked man, the official kind of smell that implied permanency. He watched the county truck's driver, whose uniform smelled faintly of sun lotion and sweat, fidget with a form. The man's eyes flicked to Martin as if seeking permission. Martin's voice, when he offered it, was honey-laced with irony. "This is about public safety, Jonah. You know how old that structure is." His breath smelled of aftershave on a hot day. His tie was slightly crooked as if he'd wrestled with it to present the right face. Jonah felt a surge of old grief. The way rules could be weaponized by people who wielded them like swords. Jonah recorded the interaction on his phone, the little red dot blooming like a heartbeat that promised evidence. The masked men bristled when they realized they were being filmed. One snapped his jaw like a dog, grunted a warning. The clipboard rustled. Rain began to stitch the air with silver thread, each drop hitting the porch and sounding like small drums. Jonah's palms were cool and dry. He could taste lake iron on his tongue. He did not sign. He did not flinch. He asked calm, precise questions that leached authority from the men with practiced exactness. Where did the order originate? Who signed it? What statutes justify emergency removal? The men answered in a tangle. Their words were slicked with preparation, but missing substance. The county inspector fumbled his credentials when pressed, and a detail Jonah asked for by name and internal routing code did not match the one printed on the copy in the truck. It was a small point, a hinge on a door the HOA had thought locked. Leah routed him a file in real time, a scanned order with a county seal and an acting judge's signature. She asked Jonah to zoom into the metadata. He did, and felt something, like vindication, when the date the file was created did not line up with the date the judge supposedly signed it. The signature was digitized, pasted. Someone had accelerated the orchestra and hoped no one would notice the offbeat. The clipped sound of Jeff Tompkins, the retired surveyor, calling from the hardware store came through Leah's line. "I can be there in 20. If you were watching, if you'd ever felt a bureaucracy move like a living thing and then be called out, you'd know the tiny victory Jonah felt, the one that was half adrenaline and half exhaustion." He turned, palms wet against his jeans, and looked at Martin. The president's nostrils flared. You could see the effort it took him to recompose. The lake smelled like rain on old wood and something metallic, like a coin dropped in a drain. Jonah felt the world tighten to the size of the deed in his drawer. 2 days of small victories and exposures became a week of grinding work. Filing complaints, meeting with the county clerk, drafting affidavits that smelled of toner and late-night resolve. Jonah's life flattened into a series of procedural moments. Stamp here, sign there, send certified mail, and watch the mail carrier's footsteps. The town began to notice because Jonah made it impossible to ignore. People do not like watching a fight they lose. They like theater where there are clear sides and neat endings. Jonah offered neither. He offered stubborn truth, and truth is messy. Montage. Monday. He visited the health inspector and watched the man's pen scratch across a form. The sting of disinfectant cleaned the surfaces, leaving a sterile scent that made Jonah's nostrils flare. Tuesday. He sat with Rosa, who handed him minutes that smelled like mildew and old glue. The paper's edges were soft as old bread. Wednesday. He watched surveillance footage frame by frame in a small office that smelled of stale coffee and carpet cleaner. Each pixel a tiny accusation or a cleared name. Thursday. He drafted a letter demanding the HOA cease and desist from posting defamatory posters. The ink dried with a whisper. Friday. Neighbors left casseroles on his doorstep, their hands smelling of paprika and the floured fingers of a Friday baker. In between these motions, someone slipped a peanut brittle bar into his mailbox with a note that read, "Stay strong." The candy tasted like an old hug. Word of the edited video spread like a cough through the town. Jonah played the footage for Leah, for Jeff, for the retired surveyor Tom, and for a woman who ran the local paper and who had begun to sniff a story. They watched the missing frames like witnesses to a conjuring trick. The place where Jonah's dock should have appeared in the surveillance was a clean rectangle of black, an absence so deliberate it suggested malice rather than error. The black felt like a stain on an otherwise tidy page of minutes. At 20% through this act, on a late Thursday afternoon when the sun slanted like an accusation and the air smelled of cut hay, Leah dropped a short, surgical legal fact into the conversation, as if she'd been waiting for the right moment to place a scalpel. An HOA cannot simply place a lien on a homeowner's property without following statutory notice and hearing requirements. In most states, notice must be certified mail, and the HOA must usually obtain a court judgment to foreclose on a lien. The sentence landed in the small conference room with a thud like a gavel. It reframed the whole fight from moral outrage to legal mechanics. Jonah felt the sentence in his bones. It was a map. They traced the HOA's paperwork line by line, and found error after error. Notices with no certified mail receipts, fines levied without formal votes, minutes altered to show a quorum that did not exist. Martin had made a habit of moving his agenda forward with a procedural sleight of hand, knitting a net of governance that looked official until someone tugged a thread. The smell of paper and printer ink clung to the files like a second skin. Jonah's team broadened. The local reporter, whose camera smelled faintly of warm plastic and cigarette smoke, ran a small piece about procedural inconsistencies. The headline was a quiet thing that made ripples. HOA, process under scrutiny. It was not viral, not at first, but it lured a light into an alley. People began to talk more openly in the feed at the hardware store, in the aisle by the nails. Conversations that had once been hushed at the post office now happened loud enough to be overheard by a teenager stocking shelves. The teenager's sneakers scuffed the linoleum like punctuation. The HOA retaliated. They doubled down on petty enforcement, issuing fines in amounts chosen for maximum sting, a kind of bureaucratic artillery fired at the vulnerable. A neighbor's fence, long leaning like an apology, was declared out of code and fined. A man who had hand-painted his mailbox was served a notice. The smell of bleach and resolve floated from the HOA office as if they rinsed their hands with righteous water. Jonah watched the pattern with a tactical mind. He cataloged each enforcement, each notice, each dollar. The fines added up for people who lived paycheck to paycheck. Small weapons in a war where glass chips mattered. Jonah's small victories hardened into a broader campaign. He held a public forum at the community center, a room that smelled of lemon polish and dry carpet, and filled it with the sound of neighbors. People who had been cowed by polite tyranny found their voices under the permission of a public stage. Someone dropped a casserole on his porch with a note. "We remember giving you keys to the lake when you saved Jacob's daughter last summer." The note smelled like rosemary and old gratitude. It was a reminder that social capital moves in long arcs. Martin's veneer began to crack in small ways. His neat suit showed grass stains when he rushed. His hand trembled slightly when he poured scotch at night, and once Jonah caught a glimpse of him at the bank signing papers with a clenched jaw, the corners of his eyes red with fatigue. A neighbor mentioned in a hushed, pitying tone that Martin had financial pressures. Jonah had seen self-righteous men buckle when their ledgers turned red. Power is a fragile currency. The knowledge of that vulnerability moved through Jonah like a current. It suggested leverage. Jonah began to follow paper trails that smelled faintly of perfume and suspicion. He traced payments to the landscaping company with the niece's name on it. He found an invoice marked Special Notice Printing billed to a post office box rented by an unknown intermediary. He took those invoices to Tom, who squinted at them and said, "Either someone's sloppy, or someone's hiding a hand." The smell of coffee in Tom's kitchen blended with the rough texture of the maps they spread on his table. They pinned the invoices with a thumb that smelled faintly of engine oil. Martin did not need to be physically violent. He smothered people with rules. He loved bylaws the way some people love hymnals. He could quote a clause and make it sound like scripture. But the more Jonah pulled at threads, the more he discovered the holes where Martin's quilt of governance had been patched with convenience. Evidence of selective enforcement flicked into focus. Properties owned by those who donated to the HOA got slack. Properties owned by critics were fined for infinitesimal infractions. The pattern smelled like favoritism and cheap cologne. As the campaign intensified, the town split further. Some clung to the illusion of orderhood sheltered by Martin's smile. Others rallied to Jonah like reeds to a bank. A woman who ran the laundromat brought him shirts soaked in detergent and offered to hang them on her line for his family. The smell of soap and warm cotton became an emblem of neighborhood solidarity. Kids who had once raced past his dock now stopped and asked questions. The lake, they said, was a place where adults argued like storms, and they wanted to know which thunder would pass. By the midpoint of Act 2, the stakes escalated in a way that was both legal and personal. The HOA had begun a smear campaign using anonymous flyers that smelled like cheap ink and spite, accusations of environmental harm, claims of illicit parties, insinuations about Jonah's character. One flyer was particularly vicious. It was left on windshields and tucked into mailboxes, its corner greasy with fingerprints. It accused Jonah of endangering children by ignoring safety standards. The rumor machine hummed. Leah warned them that slander and libel were not just social weapons, they were legal ones. The line between opinion and defamation is thin and sometimes invisible, she said, like the line between calm and panic. Jonah felt the sting of public suspicion in the way people's eyes darted past him, polite and hurried, as if proximity might stain them. He could taste bitterness like old coffee. The script of the town had changed. People read him in ways that used to belong to strangers. At 50% through the act, deep into a night that smelled of wet pavement and frying oil from a nearby diner, Jonah and Leah sat with a stack of documents, and she pushed a second legal fact across the table like a necessary bruise. Courts will look at patterns of enforcement. If you can show selective, targeted fines or amendments to minutes that match a pattern of retaliation against a specific homeowner, a judge can void those fines and may award attorney's fees, she said. The sentence sounded like a ledger balancing. Jonah's map of injustices unfurled into a strategy. They built a pattern. They collected bank statements, vendor contracts, and signatures. They mapped when fines were levied against whom and whether a quorum had actually existed at the meeting where the fines were approved. Every irregularity was another bead on a chain. The smell of printer ink and cold coffee joined in their late-night sessions like a persistent chorus. Jonah filed motions that demanded original minutes, not amended versions. He subpoenaed bank rollouts and vendor emails. The HOA's staff, so used to sliding past accountability, now felt the moment's pressure. Martin's hands, when he signed memos, had started to cramp. Martin's vulnerability emerged, not as melodrama, but as a raw human accounting. Unpaid debts and a son who needed surgery that insurance would not fully cover. A ledger Jonah acquired, one of the fewer things Martin had thought lost, showed large transfers to what looked like private accounts. The revelation didn't justify Martin's cruelty. It explained it. Men who feel cornered do irrational things. The smell of scotch and old paper in Martin's car was suddenly an emblem of a man trying to keep all plates spinning. Jonah felt no triumph in this. He felt the slippery human edge beneath villainy. The HOA tried to go scorched earth. They filed for an injunction to prevent Jonah from accessing the lake, citing imminent community harm. The town courthouse, usually a quiet room that smelled of wood polish and old lawsuits, became a stage. Cameras from the county paper arrived. Their lenses tasted of warm metal and curiosity. Jonah stood in a hall whose paint smelled faintly of lemon and history and felt the eyes of the town press him like a tide. He thought of the lake at night, how the surface swallowed moonlight, how frogs held conversations in a language he'd learned as a child, and felt a fierce, almost religious duty not to let the place change hands because of a bully's whim. He also knew the law well enough to know that injunctions could cut deeper and faster than months of fines. They worked on fear that a judge could sign something that looked permanent. He needed to move fast. Jonah's team organized, and the town's support coalesced into something with weight. Neighbors wrote sworn affidavits, attesting to the character of the dock and to the irregularities they'd witnessed. A retired judge, whom Jonah had once helped after a car breakdown, agreed to serve as a declarant. The courthouse smelled of paper and determination, as stacks of files moved from folder to clerk to bench. The air tasted like printer toner and resolve. As public pressure mounted, Martin's allies shifted. A few who had once nodded along to his decrees began to look sideways. Power, when fragile, makes acquaintances tentative. Friends distanced themselves like people stepping back from a slow leak. The rumor mill churned with the speed of small-town gossip. Did Martin really authorize forged documents? Who else had been paid out of the HOA coffers? A man who once promised security was now promising litigation. Jonah's campaign faced a brutal test when a court hearing scheduled for a Friday became the town's water cooler topic. People arrived early, filling seats until the courthouse smelled of cologne, coffee, and the nervous rustle of paper. The judge, a woman known for her terse patience and love of black coffee, peered over glasses and made a slow, clerical sound that made the room quiet. The HOA's attorney, a man with the kind of practiced smile that suggests both experience and a mild distaste for humble paperwork, laid out the HOA's claim. Emergency remediation, threat to public safety, need for immediate relief. Leah fired, back with evidence that moved like tectonic plates. Memos showing improper notice, affidavits of selective enforcement, and the forensic analysis of the edited video that showed a clean removal where Jonah's dock should have been. The scent of paper and lemon cleaner lingered in the air like a testament. The judge's expression flickered. She asked questions that peeled the case open. Jonah felt the press of time and the absolute immediacy of the moment. Microphones recorded. A reporter scribbled with a pen that smelled faintly of ink. The day after the hearing, when the judge demanded a temporary restraining order be lifted pending a full evidentiary hearing, Martin's face showed defeat in a way text cannot capture. It was raw and small. He looked at Jonah in the courtroom hallway, and there was a second of human recognition. Two people exhausted by a fight neither had intended to start the way it had started. The courthouse smelled like dust and resolution. Cameras flashed like sudden rain. But a false victory can be a trap. The HOA, smarting and desperate, doubled down in clandestine ways. Anonymous complaints targeted Jonah's neighbors, threatening their property rights. Someone broke the lock on the community shed and left tools scattered like a child's tantrum. The smell of motor oil and damp wood became a sign of trespass. Tension in the town wound tighter. Then came the night the paper published the first big exposé, a front-page story that smelled of ink and late-night deadlines. The reporter's voice on the radio felt like thunder. It documented irregularities, payments, and the edited surveillance file. The article landed like an earthquake in the papers of people who had not wanted to think of their HOA presidents as fallible. Comments poured like rain into the paper's online site. Outrage, praise, accusations. The town's mood shifted. People who had feared reprisal now saw the fight as necessary. As Act 2 pitched toward its cliff, a new variable emerged: national interest. A legal blogger with a modest following picked up the story and wrote a piece that smelled of research and righteous anger. The post ran on an afternoon that smelled of cut grass and late summer heat, and suddenly the local fight had a wider audience. Jonah received messages from strangers in towns he'd never heard of, telling him to keep his records and guard his evidence. The internet can turn a small town into a loud room. The cliffhanger came not with a showdown but with the pause of a pen. Leah sat across from Jonah at a small table that smelled of coffee and lemon oil. Around them were the stacks of subpoenas and affidavits that had become the scaffolding of the case. A camera lens from the regional news crew reflected on the window like a small, patient sun. She slid a document across the table, a settlement offer that blinked with dollar signs, and a confidentiality clause. The offer would end the fight quickly. Buy Martin a silence that smelled like honey and shame. It would also mean the HOA's wrongdoings would disappear into a sealed vault. Leah's pen hovered over the dotted line. It trembled like a thought, fighting a better judgment. Outside, the smell of rain and exhaust mingled. Jonah could taste the sticky sweetness of potential victory and the metallic tang of compromise. He thought of the lake, of the children who skipped stones, of Mrs. Caldwell's soft hands. He thought of Martin's fallible human face. He thought of the ledger that showed transfers to private accounts. He thought of the people who had placed casseroles on his porch. He looked at Leah and felt the weight of choice pressing like a thumb on a scale. The camera at the window blinked. The reporter's mic hissed faintly. The pen stationed over the offer cast a slim shadow that felt like a verdict. The pause tightened into something louder than any argument. A moment that could tip the town into quiet, hateful complicity or into loud, potentially ruinous accountability. What would you have done in my place? Drop it in the comments. Jonah might have asked the internet if this were a story told aloud, an invitation and a dare. He could see, in the reflection of Leah's glasses, the choice split into two clear roads. Immediate settlement that could buy safety, or continued litigation that could burn down a structure built on hypocrisy. The pen trembled. Leah cleared her throat and said nothing for a beat that felt like a held breath. The camera lens on the sill clicked softly, like a distant shudder. The sound of a distant engine hummed like an omen. Jonah's hand found his own pen, the cheap ballpoint he always carried, and he tapped it against the table. The click sounded like a small drum. The act closed on that suspended second, the pen in Leah's hovering like a gavel about to fall, the town holding its breath. The scent of coffee and rain and printer ink painting the air. The choice lingered like a question mark written across the horizon. Would Jonah accept a quiet end, or would he force the rotten structure into the light? The camera waited. The town held its breath. The pen hovered, and the screen outside his life filled with the expectations of 100 neighbors and the quiet presence of the lake he owned, the lake that had been the reason for all of it. He refused the hush-money offer with a pen that clicked like a small gunshot. The paper sat between him and Leah like a slab of cold meat. The confidentiality clause smelled faintly of old legalese and the sort of quiet that comes before a storm. Jonah tapped the ballpoint against the table, a metronome of decision. Outside, rain stitched the world in a thin silver thread, and the camera lens at the sill blinked like a patient eye. He thought of the kids who skimmed stones at dusk, of Mrs. Caldwell's soft hands, of a lake that had been his family's for generations. He thought of the ledger that showed a line of payments to private accounts. He thought of a man who'd turned bylaws into a business. He slid the paper back across the table. Leah's pen hovered. The silence tasted like iron. The first thing Jonah did was make sure everything was recorded. He set his phone down, hit record, and let the red dot glow like an accusation. The men who had come in masks, the county truck with its misrouted form, the edited footage. Every corner of the theater needed witnesses. The smell of printer ink hung in the room like a promise. He wanted the truth to be loud and undeniable. He wanted the town to choose its side with its eyes open. He convened the allies like commanders over maps. Rosa brought original minutes in a folder that smelled of mildew and lamp oil. Tom, the retired surveyor, spread out a brittle tracing of the riparian rights that smelled faintly of engine grease and time. Leah set up depositions and lined up a forensic video analyst who could interrogate pixels the way Jonah once interrogated witnesses. The county reporter agreed to sit in on hearings. Momentum felt like a thing you could taste. Bitter, sharp, necessary. They found the crater under Martin's empire in paperwork that smelled cheap and petty. Amended minutes with different ink, a vendor box of invoices billed to post office boxes, a voided check with an odd routing number. Each discovery was a pulse. People started to talk, not in whispers but in full sentences. Jonah walked through the town and felt eyes on him like weather. Some curious, some hostile, many relieved. The hardware store smelled of sawdust and gasoline. The baker's shop smelled of cinnamon and solidarity. A woman left a pie on his porch that tasted like gratitude and time. At 20% into the final act, in a cramped conference room that smelled of lemon cleaner and worry, Leah pressed a legal fact into the air like a scalpel. If a deed expressly grants riparian rights, courts generally enforce those rights against private associations. An HOA cannot extinguish recorded deed rights, absent an explicit conveyance or a lawful eminent domain proceeding. The words landed like a gavel. Jonah felt them in his bones because they translated legalese into a weapon. His deed was not a scrap. It was a fortress. The red LED on his phone blinked like a second heartbeat. The room hummed with the scent of wet pavement and printer toner. They went after the edited footage with the intensity of men who had once pulled people from flames. The forensic analyst, a pale man whose hands smelled faintly of coffee and cordite, played the raw files frame by frame while Jonah watched like a man watching a wound reopen. Pixel anomalies showed edits not as accident but as intention. Cuts, overlays, frames duplicated to hide a dock that had been there all along. The analyst's voice was quiet as he explained codecs and metadata, his breath hot against the winter, air leaking in under the door. Every edit was a lie with a fingerprint on it. Small-town gossip is an engine, and once fed, it will run itself. Comments on the paper's website multiplied, and the local radio ran a segment that smelled of static and righteous curiosity. Calls came from people Jonah had never met in towns he'd never visited. "We had something like that here," they said. "How did you prove it?" Their voices tasted of distance and hope. Jonah answered with the one thing he had learned, in the firehouse and the newsroom: document everything. Martin, meanwhile, practiced his face for different audiences. For donors, he wore the iron calm of a man who'd never learned how to be small. For the camera, he smiled as if he'd been cast in a soap commercial. But he began to falter in private. Hand tremors when he signed memos, late-night calls he took, with the phone pressed to his ear like a bandage. Jonah's team found a bank statement, one small, damning line of transfers leading to an account with the landscaping company's name, and that company's mailing address traced back to Martin's, Nizza. The smell of cheap cologne followed that discovery, a human scent layered under the stain of money. The town's pressure made Martin reckless. He called for a special board meeting, the kind of meeting that smells of stale coffee and brittle pastries, designed to look urgent but planned like theater. He wanted to rally the faithful, to show a front of normalcy. The meeting room crowded with people who wore either quiet dread or practiced neutrality. Cameras arrived. Jonah walked in and felt like an accused man walking into a cathedral. The room smelled of lemon oil and old wood. A projector hummed like a cage. Martin stood at the podium with a box of citations in front of him, the paper smelling of bright ink and pretense. Jonah did not shout. He did not need to. He spoke in deliberate sentences that pulled loose a thread in Martin's narrative. "This community does not belong to a committee," he said, and his voice found the room's cracks. He brought evidence, invoices, emails, a notarized affidavit from a vendor who'd been paid under a different name. He projected the edited footage, frame by frame, the black rectangle where his dock should be exposed like a carved-out lie. The projector light turned the room into a small theatrical void. The smell of popcorn from a corner concession stand mixed incongruously with the metallic tang of tension. Martin's smugness began to crumble. A woman near the back, a friend of his aunt, stood and said she had seen the invoices. Her voice shook. It smelled of dryer lint and tea bags. She described how Martin had leaned on vendors until they provided special assistance. The vendor's name was spoken like a confession. The room listened to the way power shrank when it lost its secrecy. Microphones recorded, phones recorded. The air in the meeting hall tasted like copper. Then someone stood and asked the question that had been lying all night like a small stone. Who authorized the county order? Heads turned. The question hung like a weight. Martin's smile flickered. He said nothing. The projector light burned the whites of the screens. The projector's hum sounded like distant thunder. What they unspooled next was a quiet, meticulous wrecking of an empire. Leah presented the forensic analysis of the county documents. Metadata showed a file created on a workstation outside the clerk's office and transferred in a way that left the official routing numbers mismatched. The acting judge's signature, when examined under magnification and compared to past signatures, showed signs of a digital paste. Jonah's phone buzzed with a text from the county clerk. "We didn't sign that. We never received a route." The answer tasted like victory and sorrow. People in the room breathed the air like new air. At the midpoint of the act, around the point where the stakes become visible as a cliff, Leah said another legal fact, short and sharp. Forgery of court orders and misrepresentation to obtain emergency relief can constitute criminal fraud and may void any actions taken under that order. Courts will often reopen proceedings if an instrument used to justify action is forged. The legal fact landed like a hammer. Jonah felt the world narrow. The implication was enormous. If the county order was forged, every forced action taken under it was void, and those responsible could face criminal charges. The taste of the sentence was metallic and ripe with consequence. They served subpoenas like surgical strikes. Bank records arrived with the clinical smell of bureaucracy, an odor of paper and fluorescent light. The landscaping invoices, the vendor emails, the voided checks, each paper was a breadcrumb. Jonah's team showed a map of payments, to Martin's, niece's company, to a shell company registered at an abandoned storefront, to a P.O. box with no enrolled name. The pattern read like a trail of breadcrumbs through a forest of plausible deniability. People gasped in the meeting. Some cheeks flushed like kindling. Martin tried to argue procedural necessity. He waved bylaws that smelled of varnish and old authority. But Leah had already built a lattice of procedural failings. Lack of certified notice, amended minutes with inconsistent handwriting, fines issued without quorum, edited footage used as evidence. Each procedural misstep acted like a cut in the net Martin had stitched. The more he tried to explain, the more the town smelled the rot, a mixture of old cologne, diesel, and paper. His control, once a comfortable garment, had become tight and wrong. There was a moment, small and human, that Jonah would not forget. After the meeting, when the room emptied and the fluorescent lights hummed like bees, Martin sat alone at the head table with a styrofoam cup of coffee steaming, its smell bitter and honest. He placed his head in his hands, and for a sliver of a second, the kind of instant a camera does not catch, he looked like a man who had finally been seen as he truly was, small and scared and cornered by the consequences of his choices. The sight made Jonah's stomach twist. Vindication is not always a sweet thing. Because the stakes had become criminal as well as civil, the county prosecutor's office took an interest. Detectives visited the town with a quiet efficiency that smelled faintly of rain and duty. They interviewed board members under oath, traced IP addresses, and examined the servers that hosted the HOA's emails. The climate in town shifted from spectacle to legal machinery, the gears of justice turning with a low, inexorable hum. Evidence, once anecdotal, now carried the weight of statute. The HOA pushed back with one last incendiary move. They tried to sue Jonah personally for defamation because of the newspaper piece and the public accusations. The suit was a strategic cudgel, tie him up in fees and claws. Jonah's phone ringed with threats and fear, but Leah had anticipated the move. She countermoved with discovery requests that pried open the HOA's bank accounts and forced testimony under oath. The legal chessboard tilted. Every offensive became a liability for the HOA. The smell of litigation is a sharp, clinical thing. Paper, and coffee and late-night lights. And Jonah found he had come to like its clarity. The community rallied in ways that felt intangible and fierce. A group of neighbors formed a watch team to guard the dock, their sneakers whispering on the boardwalk like a quiet army. Someone painted a mural on the community shed that smelled of acrylic and defiance. A lake scene with Jonah's cabin in it, bright and stubborn. Kids skateboarded past with the smell of summer sugar cones trailing behind them. Donations for Jonah's legal fund came in from people near and far. The online legal blog had stirred more than curiosity. It had opened wallets and phone lines. The town felt, in small things, like a place being rewoven. The decisive hour came on a Tuesday when the courthouse smelled of paper and rain, and the fluorescent lights hummed like an anxious insect. The judge called the evidentiary hearing to order, and the room filled with a gravity that tasted like cold metal. Lawyers stood like chess players about to move. Leah presented the forensic analyst first. He testified with the calm intensity of someone who knew pixels the way others knew the weather. He explained the edits in plain English, while the projector showed side-by-side frames, the black rectangle like a missing tooth. The sheriff's office brought in the county inspector to testify. Under oath, the inspector testified that he had not signed the order and had not been present at the scene the day the marshal men in masks arrived. His voice shook. It smelled faintly of sunscreen and conscience. The prosecutor, a woman with a voice like a bell, asked questions that stripped away illusions. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish and the human scent of people sitting too long. Every testimony hammered another nail into the coffin of the HOA's narrative. Then Leah had a move that was cinematic, not because it was flashy, but because it was perfect. She called the HOA's supposed marshal to the stand, and a forensic testimonial showed his phone location data placing him miles away at the time he claimed to be on Jonah's property. The man's face went slack. The camera caught every color. Phones buzzed in pockets. The smell of coffee became a chorus. For a moment, the room was a small, concentrated universe of truth and its consequences. The climax arrived so suddenly it felt like a physical blow. Leah presented a printout from the server that hosted the HOA's meeting recordings. The raw files with metadata that traced the edited footage to a user account registered under Martin's email. The prosecutor rose and asked a simple question. Mr. Ellsworth, can you explain why your user account shows access to the files that contain the edits used in the HOA's enforcement? Martin's face, for the first time since this began, lost its practiced expressions. He stammered. The courtroom smelled like wet paper. There was a silence long enough to break. Then a gavel landed like thunder. The judge's palm hit the wood with a force that echoed through the hall, the kind of gavel slam that makes 1,000 whispers stop. The sound was a physical thing, sharp and authoritative, and it carried the weight of every procedure Martin had ignored. Cameras flashed. The sheriff's deputies leaned forward like men waiting to record history. The gavel's echo tasted like finality. The court found in Jonah's favor on several counts. The forged county order was declared void. All actions taken under it were reversed. The fines and liens the HOA had placed without proper notice were vacated. The court appointed a receiver to oversee a forensic audit of the HOA's finances, and recommended criminal referral for anyone found to have participated in forging and fraud. The judge quoted statutes that sounded, in the quiet aftermath, like old truths: fiduciary duty, procedural notice, criminal fraud. The air smelled like rain-washed streets and relieved lungs. Leah pushed a final legal fact across the bench with the precision of a surgeon. In many states, if an HOA repeatedly violates fiduciary duties and statutory procedures, courts can, under specific statutes, appoint a receiver, dissolve the association, or order restitution to affected homeowners. The sentence settled like a verdict. It meant that an HOA built on corruption could be dismantled, not by rumor, but by law. The word dissolve hung in the air like a promise. For Jonah, those words were less about triumph than about repair, the sloughing off of rot so the town might grow again. Once the judge signed the order for an audit and criminal referral, the town exhaled. People came to the courthouse steps like they were arriving at a shore. The baker's shop smelled like vanilla and celebration. The hardware store handed out discounts for volunteers who helped mend fences. Martin was escorted from the room, his shoulders small beneath the weight of his choices. He looked at Jonah, and there, in the briefest of exchanges, was something like apology and something like defeat. The lake, for its part, kept answering to tides. Jonah did not leap into triumph with shrieks and banners. He walked to the water, the dock creaking under the soles of his shoes, smelling damp wood and cedar smoke. Kids waved from the other shore. Mrs. Caldwell brought lemonade that tasted like sun and courage. The mural on the shed now had an added corner, a small painted plaque that read, in neat block letters, "For truth, for water, for all of us." The town, knot by slow knot, began to stitch itself back. People mended porches, painted fences, and brought casseroles. The smell of sawdust and rosemary became the town's new perfume. Martin's fall did not erase the trauma. People interviewed him and said things that were small and human, about his son's surgery, about late-night phone calls, about the pressure of running a small organization that had swelled beyond competence. The story complicated into human textures. Jonah did not gloat. He felt that the collapse had a cost. Power corrupted not because it is inherently evil, but because it is tasty and unregulated. The town learned a bitter lesson about governance and humility. The final resolution included more than court orders. The county prosecuted a small ring of conspirators who had altered the footage and helped craft the forged order. They pled or faced trials that smelled of sweat and fluorescent light. The audit turned up misspent funds and a handful of checks that had been cashed for dubious services. Some neighbors who had profited from Martin's system faced restitution. The HOA, after shareholders and homeowners met with the receiver, voted under court supervision to dissolve and reorganize under new, transparent bylaws with a financial oversight committee and mandatory audits. The smell of bleach and paper was replaced by the neutral scent of new paint and hope. Jonah's deed stood solid. The court reaffirmed his riparian rights, and the case set a precedent in the county for enforcing recorded deed rights against overreaching private associations. The legal precedent tasted like salt and permanence. Leah's name was mentioned in grateful tones. The reporter's byline became a small local legend, and Rosa's careful filing got a nod at the town's next civic meeting. Jonah paid his legal bills with a fund raised by neighbors, and some donated support. He refused a single penny from the HOA settlement fund. The town had paid its dues in the currency of attention. There were smaller human victories that mattered as much as the legal ones. The young surveyor Tom got his knee worked on with donations from neighbors whose fences he had measured for free. The hardware store owner hung a plaque honoring volunteerism. The mural was restored after vandals, leftover resentments, stuck paint on it in a small, ugly night that smelled of beer and bitter. The night after, people repainted the defaced sections with fresh strokes, the smell of acrylic and community in the air. The lake healed slowly, the water forgiving but remembering. Jonah stood on his dock one evening as the sun broke like honey across the surface, and he thought of how things had changed. He had gone into the fight with tools and documents, with the patience of someone used to slow, precise work. He had not expected the fight to become a cause. He had not expected to carry so many people into battle with him. He felt gratitude like a warm weight in his chest, and tiredness like an old friend. The air smelled of cedar and lemon and the faint metallic edge of the court's stamp. He turned to the town and said, in a quiet that rippled outward like stone thrown into a pool, "This was never just my fight. It was ours." He looked straight at the camera of the regional reporter and into the lenses of phones that would replay the moment. His voice tasted like gravel and honey, rough and right. For closure, the community planted a small grove near the lake with trees that would, in a generation, shade new families. The smell of turned earth and green leaves became a daily reminder that governance must be watched, not worshipped. The HOA's old office became a community room where meetings were open and minutes were posted online with audited copies. The receiver's final report was published and read at a town hall, its pages smelling of new print and resolution. People signed up for oversight committees. They learned the language of motions and votes the way children learn to skip stones. And Martin, he faced charges, and the town watched as the human cost of his choices unfolded. Some neighbors felt pity. Others felt the hard comfort of justice. Jonah did not celebrate the man's collapse with malice. He felt, at the edge of things, the complicated mercy that comes when a community saves itself from a bully. The town had chosen sunlight over secrecy, and with that came an uneasy but necessary peace. The last scene is quiet and rooted. Jonah closes the cabin door and places the deed into the drawer where it belongs, the paper smelling of lamp oil and solidity. He sits at the kitchen table and writes a letter to the town, an invitation to join in the work of municipal care, a request for vigilance, a promise to answer when they called. The house smells of cedar and coffee. The lake outside breathes steady and blue. Children play across the water, their laughter tasting like raw sugar. He looks at the camera one last time as the sun slips down. painting the lake in tarnished gold, and says, "Not as a boast, but as a dare." Where are you watching from? Comment now. If your HOA has crossed the line, tell us. We did not win because one man fought alone. We won because a town remembered how to look after its own. If you believe no one is above the law, hit subscribe. Share this story. Let it be a warning and a map. His voice is steady, the call to action a bridge. The town would not be perfect. There would be friction, petty grievances, new people with new ideas. But the old rot had been removed. The lake, once a point of contention, was now a commons, governed with transparent bylaws, annual audits, and mandatory disclosure of conflicts of interest. The dock returned to its rightful place. Boat motors hummed like bees again. The smell of gasoline mixed with cedar and sunscreen. Justice had been messy and slow and sometimes painful, but it had been real. The court's final order included restitution, a recommendation for dissolution of the HOA as it had been, and a path forward that smelled of fresh paint and honest paper. Mrs. Caldwell baked a cake, and the hardware store held a barbecue. People came and set chairs on the lawn. The laughter that rose off the lake that night tasted like relief. Jonah knew, as anyone who's ever stood against a small-voice tyranny knows, that the fight never ends. Vigilance is a job with no retirement, but for one long season, the town had chosen transparency over secrecy, community over convenience, truth over expedience, and the lake kept answering to the moon. So here is the final ask. If this story moved you, if you felt the sting of a petty authority or the triumph of a small victory, drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Share a story of a time your town stood up. Hit subscribe so we can keep shining a light on the small injustices that grow in shadows. Like, share, and tag someone who needs to see how a community can dismantle a corrupt HOA together. If you want another insane takedown, tell me which story to pull apart next. The law is a long knife when you know where the handle is. The screen fades on the last image. The dock, the lake, the mural, and a town learning to keep its own house. The final sound is the slap of water against wood, regular and true. The ending is not a full stop but a comma, a promise. Stay watchful, stay kind, stay loud.